James gives us the authority for our study this morning. Take, my brethren, take the prophets who have spoken in the name of the Lord. And that is the great qualification of all prophets. Jeremiah was told in Jeremiah 26 verse 2, go out and stand in the temple, say these words and diminish not a word. And that's the great thing about God's prophets, is that they say what God has said. They repeat it over and over again without compromise. And very often it leads to suffering, affliction, and patience. And God is saying to us through people like Ezekiel and Jeremiah, don't be wearied in that practice. Don't faint in your minds and say, it's all too hard. I can't keep doing this. We're going to try and catch the spirit of God's prophet through Ezekiel. Now just notice in chapter 3, verse 10 we just read, that when Ezekiel was given these things to say, God says, Son of man, all my words that I shall speak unto thee, receive in thine heart. We are not just trumpets of the Watchman. We are not just a voice speaking the words of God. To be a good prophet, we must first receive it in our own heart and hear it with our own ears. It's got to be part of us. And then we can teach others what God has said. And so God says, you get this inside of you. Make it part of your own heart. Now, let's just clear up some of the major themes about Ezekiel, because we want to come to the man and his wife, because that's really the heart of our story. And there's a little thing at the end of the talk, which Brother Phil's waiting for, but which is about the remnant. But we want to just get rid of the big themes of Ezekiel. Now, both Ezekiel and Jeremiah were types of the Lord Jesus Christ. Ezekiel and Jesus both started their public mission at the age of 30. Ezekiel was born to be a priest. Jesus became the great high priest. They both horrified the Jews by prophesying the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and the imminent end of the Jewish state. That was the common theme of what they said to the Jews of their time. They both lifted the veil on Jewish religion to expose the hypocrisy, the wickedness, and the transgressions of the leadership. You will see that Ezekiel deals almost entirely through this book with the elders of the Jews that came from Jerusalem that now sit in front of him to get news about Jerusalem. And he keeps exposing the hypocrisy, the idols in their hearts. But they keep coming. And it's like Jesus, isn't it, with the Pharisees and the scribes. They can't stay away. They're drawn inexorably to hear his words, but they completely refuse to do them. But they're entranced by the words that he has to say. And it's the same here in Babylon with Ezekiel and the elders. And they both bore the title Son of Man. Let's just explore that one a little more freely. You know, God calls Ezekiel Son of Man 92 times in this book. 92 times, Son of Man. He is never ever called by God the Son of Man. And we need to make that very clear differentiation. The designation, the Son of Man, is reserved solely in the Bible for the Lord Jesus Christ. The Son of Man that God had made strong for himself, Psalm 80 verse 17. The Son of Man that hath power to forgive sins, John 5. The Son of Man that hath power to judge the resurrected, John 5. So Jesus is distinctly the Son of Man. Jesus is called the Son of Man 81 times in the 4 gospel records. He uses that quite differently of himself than is what we have here in referring to Ezekiel. Jesus is the Son of Man. He's not just a human being. He's the one man that God made strong of the whole human race. The one human by whose obedience he would reverse the curse, restore dominion, says Psalm 8. The Son of Man would restore dominion and fellowship with God. So Jesus is a different person to the way that Ezekiel is addressed. The title Son of Man that's given to Ezekiel first comes in chapter 2 and verse 1. He said unto me, Son of Man. So God now addresses him by this title right through the book. Hebrew is Ben Adam, the builder of the humans. He represents all of us, brethren and sisters. And we need to look at these prophets, particularly when it's in the visions, like we saw with Zechariah in the visions. They represent us, crowning the king. And we're going to find that Ezekiel goes on a journey with us, and he takes us not only on a journey through what God has revealed, but all the things of the future. He takes us on a tour of the temple in chapters 40 to 48. So when God says Son of Man, he's taking the focus off the person Ezekiel and saying, this is all of you who are included on this journey that he goes through. So that's why he's called the Son of Man. Okay. Like Ezekiel, we must see visions of God. We must hear God's word that he delivered. We must learn from them and take them into our hearts and faithfully speak God's words until the Lord returns. Now, who was this man Ezekiel? Well, he was taken away in the second wave of the captivity. The first captivity had occurred in the 4th year of Jehoiakim. 7 years later, in the 3-month reign of Jehoiachin, the Babylonians came back, bumped Jehoiakim off in a terrible way, took Jehoiachin and his mother captive and took away the good figs. And it was in this second captivity in BC, about 597, I think it is, that Ezekiel and his wife were taken away. Now, I want you to come to chapter 1 in this book, because we're told there of the dating of this book. There was only 11 years left now from the time that Ezekiel was taken captive in Jehoiachin's captivity until the kingdom of Judah would finally fall. And Ezekiel commences his ministrations at the age of 30, which is the same year that Jesus commenced. It was 5 years after the captivity of Jehoiachin. Chapter 1, verse 1. It came to pass in the 30th year of his life. In the 4th month, in the 5th day of the month, I was among the river, and he gets this glorious vision of the cherubim. So he's now 30 when God starts to talk to him as a prophet. He'd been there for 5 years. So he left at 25. You can imagine his wife was probably about 23 or 24, which is the normal course of things happens. And Ezekiel spoke to the Jews that were exiled in Babylon, reporting on and prophesying about events that were going on back in Jerusalem. And almost everything we have from the mouth of Ezekiel is directly given by divine revelation. Now that's quite different to Jeremiah. You know, one of the great things you can do in the book of Jeremiah is to go through and just colour in the words of Jeremiah. If you want a list, I can provide it for you. But colour in the words of Jeremiah, and you'll find Jeremiah is constantly arguing with God, resigning from his commission, and saying to God, it's not fair. And all the private thoughts of Jeremiah are there. You don't get much of that with Ezekiel. What Ezekiel was, he was God's foreign correspondent. He was in Babylon. There were many Jews still back in Jerusalem. There were lots of relatives that were on either side of the divide. And there was no communication in those days like we have. The only way the Jews in Babylon would know what's happening back in Jerusalem and why was through the words of Ezekiel. Apart from the occasional letters that went back and forth, and 1 or 2 times a messenger comes, there was very little communication for that 11 years of the reign of Zedekiah. And the Jews in exile recognized that God was talking through Ezekiel, so they came to hear him. Look at chapter 8 and verse 1. Chapter 8 and verse 1. Came to pass in the 6th year, in the 5th day of the month. So the 6th year of his captivity, the 6th year of Zedekiah. I sat in my house, and the elders of Judah sat before me. And they were waiting for him to have a revelation, and the hand of God descends on him, and he's now got another message for him. And they came quite regularly. Chapter 9 and verse 25, you find the same thing. Sorry, it's the wrong one. Doesn't matter, but you'll find it in a number of places where chapter 14, verse 1, they often come and they sat before him. And so the elders came often and they sat and listened, but they did not like the message. They didn't like the fact that he constantly spoke of the impending doom of Jerusalem and the temple. They were patriotic. They longed for better news of God's land. Many still had families back there. And they felt the vastness of separation from the land and from the temple courts. You know the words of Psalm 137, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, unable to sing the songs of Zion because we're so sad at heart. And we need to appreciate that in those times there was no newspapers. There was no radio, no television, no internet. They had no idea what's happening back in God's land where their hearts were. There was no instant news like we are conditioned to receive. And so they clung to their conviction that they were Abraham's seed, that the Jews were a superior nation, that they were God's chosen, and it could not possibly happen that God would let Gentiles destroy his temple and his city. They just couldn't get that into their heads. So Ezekiel's got a problem. He doesn't just have to tell them that bad news is going to happen to Jerusalem and the temple. He's got the job of trying to change the hearts of those people standing before him. Now just come to chapter 14. We're going to start and end our talk today in chapter 14. But in chapter 14, here's what he had to tell the elders that came and sat before him. There came certain of the elders in verse 1 and sat before me. And they were doing this right through the book, over and over again. And he's now going to tell them they're a bunch of hypocrites. He's going to show them why Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, and to point out to them that the very sins that will lead to the destruction of Jerusalem are still in their hearts. They might have been removed from Jerusalem and all the wickedness of the reign of Zedekiah and Jehoiakim, but they have brought it with them in their hearts. If you haven't coloured this in chapter 14, verse 3, Son of man, these men have set up idols in their heart, a stumbling block of their iniquity. In verse 4, the idols in his heart, and put the stumbling block of his iniquity. Verse 5, I may take the house of Israel in their own heart through their idols. In verse 7, the idols in their hearts and the stumbling block of their iniquity. You know, when you get that repetition in the Bible, this is what the message is. Ezekiel had already given them the prophecy of the hole in the wall in chapter 8, where he puts like a projector through the minds of the men back in Jerusalem. And all the shocking imagery that came up on the wall when the projector was put through their heads. And now he's saying to these people, you are no better than those back in Jerusalem. The same sins that are going on back there, you've got them in your hearts. And you read Ezekiel 8 about those in Jerusalem, it's almost the same language. And he's trying to show them your national psyche is wrong. You think that you are great because you're the seed of Abraham. Well, it's not true. You will only be great in God's eyes when your hearts are in tune with God's. Circumcision is of the heart. Salvation's an individual matter. Now look at the appeal he makes here. You know, heart in verse 4, heart in verse 5, heart in verse 7. Heart in verse 3. Get your hearts right, is what he's saying. Hearts must be changed. That was one thing he had to contend with. Hypocrites standing in front of him all the time. The second thing he had to contend against was the false prophets. So just come across to Jeremiah 29. One of the great ways to help understand the book of Ezekiel is to realise how much overlaps with Jeremiah. And once you've got a sense of the connection between the two, then there are so many things that are common to both books. Now, contending against false prophets is one of the hardest things that God's prophets had to do. Jeremiah says, my heart is broken because of the false prophets. And that's Jeremiah 23, verse 9. My heart is broken because of false prophets. Now, there were two false prophets that we know of in Babylon that ended up being roasted in the fire by Nebuchadnezzar. They were not delivered by God's angel. Jeremiah 29 and verse 30. Hear the word, this is a letter from Jeremiah to Babylon. Hear the word of Yahweh, all you of captivity who are sent to Babylon, from Jerusalem to Babylon. So he's writing to the same people that are talking to Ezekiel. Thus saith Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel, of Ahab the son of Kaliah and Zedekiah the son of Maasai, which prophesy a lie unto you in my name, behold, I'll deliver them to the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. He shall slay them, and they'll become a prophet. How's he going to slay them? Well, he's going to burn them in the fire, verse 22. They will become a proverb of what happens to false prophets. They were roasted in the fire. We know what that fire was like from Daniel chapter 3, don't we? So there were false prophets over there in Babylon that Jeremiah had to point out were going to end up roasted. But you can imagine what a grief that was to Ezekiel. There were others back in Jerusalem like Hananiah. Look at chapter 28. It came to pass in chapter 28 in the verse 1, beginning of the reign of Zedekiah. Now, beginning is a fairly loose term. It's the 4th year. When did Ezekiel start prophesying? In the 5th year. So the letter of chapter 29, which was sent from Zedekiah, chapter 29, verse 3, occurs in the 5th year. And it's a direct response to the prophecy of Hananiah back in Jerusalem. And Hananiah had sent letters to the captives in Babylon saying, look, you've been taken away, but you won't be there long. And his prophecy was only 2 years. That was his prophecy. Verse 3, within 2 full years will I bring you again to this place. All the vessels, and put that one aside for the next talk. All the vessels that the Nebuchadnezzar took away were all going to come back in 2 years. Now he's prophesying in the 4th year of Zedekiah. It takes 4 months for a messenger to get across, or maybe 3 or 4 months to get across to Babylon. The response that comes in chapter 29. And it's the letter that Jeremiah now sends to Babylon to counteract the prophecy of Hananiah. Now, Hananiah was put to death by God for his false words, for the false hopes that he raised. There were also letters coming the other way. Look at chapter 29 and verse 24. Jeremiah's letter addresses another false prophet in Babylon. Thou shalt speak to Shemaiah the Nehelamite and say, thus saith the word of God. Because you've sent letters in thy name to the people in Jerusalem, to Zephaniah the son of Maaseiah the priest. And what was going on with this Shemaiah character was, or Shemaiah, he was sending letters from Babylon saying, we've got to get rid of the priests and replace the priesthood in Jerusalem with people that we like. So there was a lot of background controversy going as these letters went back and forth. So another problem Ezekiel had to contend with was false prophets under his own nose and disconcerting letters from Hananiah that they were only going to stay for 2 years. Now just keep that timing. It's really critical to see what's going on here. But let's just clear up the themes. Back in Ezekiel chapter 14, I want to show you now one of the other major themes of Ezekiel. The phrase or forms of it that occurs 74 times in the book of Ezekiel is, they shall know that I am Yahweh. Look at it in chapter 14 and verse 23, at the end of it. And when they shall comfort you when you see their ways and their doings, and ye shall know that I have done it. I've not done it without cause. And that comes in say, different forms, but ye shall know that I am Yahweh. They shall know that I am Yahweh. When this comes to pass, you shall know that a prophet has been among them. And the key word is know. People will one day have to face up to this. So it's usually found at the end of each individual prophecy. Everything Ezekiel said would happen would come to pass with great accuracy. Men would then realize that Yahweh has foreknowledge and power to fulfill his will. The Armageddon chapters, chapter 37 to 40, are absolutely jam-packed with this statement. And they shall know that I am Yahweh. And they shall know that I am Yahweh. And sooner or later, both Jew and Gentile will be forced to acknowledge that God is in control. God can be ignored, disobeyed, put out of people's minds. But in the end, when it comes to pass, with unerring accuracy, they will know that God was in control all along. So there's another theme of Ezekiel you can follow through. 74 times statements like that. Now, the one we haven't got time to deal with at all is, other than just mentioning it, is the glory. The glory appears in chapter 1 to 3 in the cherubic visions to open the book. The glory departs, as you well know, in chapter 11, by stages. The glory then prepares to return in chapter 33 with the regathering of the people. And in chapter 40 of Ezekiel, which I'm sure that you've just covered recently in your effort, the glory returns by the way of the east and comes back into temple with Christ and the saints in that grand march into that building. So there's another theme about the glory. We're not going to go there because it's just too massive, obviously, to think about. We're going to talk about the man Ezekiel himself. Now, some interesting facts about the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel means God will strengthen. The hand of God was upon me is a common statement he makes. The hand of God was upon me. So he was strengthened to put these visions forward. Now I'm going to make 3 statements that I think at first your brain will reject. Everything we know about Ezekiel comes from his own book and nowhere else. Ezekiel mentions Daniel, Job, and Jeremiah and various kings by name. But his name is mentioned only twice in 48 chapters and only twice in the whole Bible. You find that in chapter 1, verse 3. Let's go back there. The word of Yahweh came expressly to Ezekiel. And you find it in chapter 24, verse 4. And it's nowhere else in the Bible. That's the second amazing fact about the book of Ezekiel. The third one I found even more astounding. There is not one direct quotation in the New Testament from the book of Ezekiel. There's a few allusions. Look at the end of chapter 3. Chapter 3 and verse 27. Thus saith Adonai Yahweh, he that heareth, let him hear. That's quoted by Jesus in Matthew 13, verse 9. It's an allusion. It's picking up the same spirit of the prophet. But there's not one direct quotation from Ezekiel into the New Testament. But think how much we learn from Ezekiel about God's future plans. We have the exact detail in the dry bones of the stages of the revival of Israel. We have most of the detail about Armageddon in Ezekiel 38. We have the future temple of the age to come. We have the worship, the priesthood, the divisions of the land. All of that we get from the book of Ezekiel. And it's not quoted in the New Testament. You know, Ezekiel is an incredible book. It's a mixture of present uncomfortable realities and mind-expanding visions of the future. But there's just 3 or 4 facts just to think about, and we can discuss over lunch why that may be the way. As I said, we have very, very few of the personal thoughts of Ezekiel himself. There's almost no trace of his personal life, other than a few clues here and there. Nothing like Jeremiah with his anger, frustration, depression, sad feelings, and resignations. So let's come to Ezekiel 1 verse 1, and let's just trace this man Ezekiel. He began to prophesy at the age of 30, the 5th year of Jehoiachin's captivity, 598 BC. 25, when carried away amongst the good figs with his wife. I want you to notice that. They had 6 years together in Babylon. And they were amongst the good figs. You know, Jehoiachin's captivity was described in Jeremiah as the good figs being taken away. And they took away the capable people, the tradesmen, the smiths, but also those who had potential. And God selected who went. And we're going to see that at the end of our talk. God picked out certain people to be taken away. He was happily married. They arrived together in Babylon. He was born to be a priest, but unlike other priests, he would never get to be one. He was going to be like Samuel and Jeremiah. The greatest work they would be was not as priests, but as prophets, and becoming the national conscience. The age of 30 was when you normally started your work as a priest. But in Babylon, there's no temple, no sacrifices, no law-keeping possible. He still, though, could teach divine knowledge. And where had he been educated? Now, you've got to put the chronology together. The 5th year of Jehoiachin's captivity, when he left Jerusalem. That means that he had been in Jeremiah's Sunday school class and youth group. Jeremiah had been prophesying for 29 years before the second captivity that took Ezekiel and his wife to Babylon. His whole 25 years were in the days when Jeremiah was at his greatest prophecy. Daniel had gone off in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, about 7 years before the captivity of Jehoiachin. He'd been in Jeremiah's Sunday school class. Daniel was about 24 when Ezekiel arrives at the age of 25. You see what God's doing? He's taking the young people and he's putting them in Babylon for a purpose. They undoubtedly would have known each other, because Ezekiel refers to Daniel favourably twice in his prophecies. He knew all about Daniel and Daniel's faith and Daniel's prayers for other people. They had grown up together in the same youth group. Daniel, however, seems to have been restricted by his regal duties from spending a lot of time with the exiles. You don't find very much contact between Daniel and the exiles. But we know that he regularly prayed for them. It seems that Ezekiel was the one who had the charge of day-to-day contact with the exiled Jews. He lived by the river of Kibar. He had a house large enough that could contain all the elders who came and regularly sat before him. And as sisters who have meetings in their homes know, that's not just the work of the husband. To have lots of elders come and sit in your house means the wife has to be engaged in the process. The critical date in chapter 1, verse 1, the 5th year of Zedekiah. As I said, it was the same time the letter comes from Jerusalem, from Jeremiah, overriding the letter of Hananiah that said only 2 years. And you know what Jeremiah said? You know it backwards, don't you? Jeremiah said to the exiles in Babylon through his letter, pray for the peace of Babylon. That was almost like cyanide to a Jew. Pray for the peace of Babylon. You're going to be there for 70 years. Build houses, plant vineyards. That was not what patriotic Jews wanted to hear. And that was the thing that began the ministry of Ezekiel. The same time that God appears to him comes the letter from Jeremiah. Pray for the peace. You're going to be here for 70 years. And that letter was seen very widely as treason by the patriotic Jews. And Ezekiel has to disabuse them of the notion that Jerusalem and the temple will survive. No wonder he became so unpopular. Now let's just think about the very unusual ways that he had to use to educate the Jews in Babylon. Come to Ezekiel 24 and verse 24. This is in the midst of the sign of his wife dying, but it gives us the key to how God used Ezekiel in those first 6.5 years. Ezekiel 24 and verse 24. We'll come back to his wife later on. Thus Ezekiel is unto you a sign. According to all that he hath done shall ye do. And when this cometh to pass, ye shall know that I am Adonai Yahweh. Now where it says, according to all that he hath done shall ye do it, what it means is what Ezekiel portrays in mime and acting is going to happen to Jerusalem. It's going to happen to you Jews. So when Jerusalem falls, you're not going to mourn either. So Ezekiel was a man of sign. What he does, what he teaches, he does by enactment. Now, why the need for the signs? Come back to Ezekiel chapter 3, the chapter we read. This is why for 6.5 years he had to do everything by mime and enactment and portraying it in such funny ways. In Ezekiel 3 and verse 26, God says, look, you're dealing with a very rebellious house. Ezekiel had been through a 7 days of bitterness of spirit. When he realized the serious nature of the prophecy he had to give, he was silent for 7 days. And God says, look, I'm going to make it harder for them, Ezekiel. Verse 26, I will make thy tongue cleave to the roof of thy mouth. Thou shalt be dumb and shall not be to them a reprover. In other words, Ezekiel, you can't go and say your own words. You can't go and give exhortations based on what I've said. You're going to be limited to saying only the words I give you because they are a rebellious house. When I speak with thee, I will open thy mouth and thou shalt say to them, thus saith the Lord God. So the only words he could utter for 6.5 years were words that came directly by God's revelation. So this is quite some early thing. This happens in the 5th year when he was now the age of 30. On some occasions, he could deliver those direct messages from God, but not often. No personal comment, no exhortation, no questions. So we have mimes and charades and role plays to get the message across. Let's go through chapter 4, just as an example. We have a model of Jerusalem built on a clay tablet with a siege around it in verse 1 and 2. Then we have an iron pan in verse 3, held up to his face with a picture of Jerusalem there. Then he lays for 390 days in verse 4 and 8 of chapter 4 on one side and 40 days on the other side to portray the length of the siege. He starves himself, eating only bread and water. He has to cook his food with cow dung to illustrate the privations of the siege in verse 9 to 17. In chapter 5, verse 1 to 4, he cuts his hair off, throws some to the wind, chops some up, and burns the rest. Why? To demonstrate the certainty of the coming captivity and the scattering of Israel. He portrayed Zedekiah's futile plan of escape in chapter 12. He had to take his furniture, put it on his back and dig a hole under the wall. What a stupid thing to do. And the Jews said, what's wrong with him? What's he up to? He's carrying furniture under a wall when you could go around it. And what he's doing is portraying Zedekiah's futile escape plan. But when the Babylonians were about to take the city, he'd built a tunnel out to get out of the city, left his wives behind, but took too much stuff with him, and they caught up with him at Jericho. And Ezekiel has to prophesy that to the Jews in Babylon. He won't get away. And Jeremiah is saying to him at the same time, you will not escape. But Zedekiah thinks he's too smart for everybody. He sets up in chapter 21, Ezekiel sets up signposts to indicate the very direct route that Nebuchadnezzar will take as he comes down to take Jerusalem. So it's full of signs. And he's a human billboard. Now let's come to chapter 24 and take the last great sign that he has to do. Remember, this was now 6 years. Well, this is actually only 4 years from his captivity when he makes this sign. In chapter 24 and verse 1, we have Ezekiel in the chapter where he loses his wife. It's the 9th year and the 10th month and the 10th day of the month. And your margin's got 2 Kings 25 and Jeremiah 39. This is the day the final siege started. So it's absolutely connected to what's going on back in Jerusalem. Precisely the day the siege began. We're going to talk about these two people because she's going to suffer this day a sudden death. And when she does, we find in verse 16, Ezekiel is absolutely forbidden to mourn. No public demonstration of mourning is allowed. Between verse 16 and 25, no public mourning allowed. Now, this whole chapter shows us the incredible cost of being a prophet. They were both, at this stage, somewhere around the age of 30 or less. And can I say, I really loved the picture last night of Ezekiel's wife. It just showed to me the strength of character that that woman must have had. It was hard enough to be exiled away from your family, homes, and land. It was hard enough to face opposition from false prophets who denied the words that you spoke. But to suffer the loss of your beloved wife and companion, described so beautifully in verse 16 as the desire of your eyes, is a very tragic thing indeed. You know, God looked at these two and saw their very close and loving relationship. And sadly, he knew that it was essential to this enactment. This is how serious God was in putting this in front of the people, that he would take away that woman under the age of 30. And in verse 18, it says, I spake to the people in the morning. So he gets this message from God. He gets the word of God in verse 15 in the morning. And he goes straight out into the street and he says, God has said, my wife is going to die. And the evening comes and she dies suddenly. And next day in verse 18, he must show no public grief in any way. Now, to not mourn is something very unusual for the Jews. They were always very good at exorbitant shows of grief. Jairus' daughter, Dorcas. You know all those incidents where they always have this great ceremony. Absolutely no mourning. No change of clothes. Keep a good expression on your face. Smile at everybody. Now, why would God exact such a terrible price on the prophet? Well, look at verse 21. You've got to make the connection. When they ask you, why aren't you mourning? You shall say to them, behold, I will profane my sanctuary, the excellency of your strength, the temple, the desire of your eyes, and that which your soul pities, and your sons and daughters that you've left behind in the land. He's talking to these elders. They've got children back in Jerusalem who are going to probably die in the siege. You have to realize that you're going to lose something incredibly precious to you, you Jews. And you shall do as I have done in verse 22. You shall not cover your lips nor eat the bread of men. You won't mourn. You will be so overwhelmed that mourning will be almost impossible. You shall not mourn nor weep. You shall pine away for iniquities. You're going to realize that your children back there died because of you, because of your sins and your idolatry as you followed Jehoiakim. And you'll blame yourself. You'll pine away for your iniquities and mourn one toward another. And I'm going to take Ezekiel's wife to show you that. And he comes back to it in verse 25. Also, son of man, shall it not be in the day when I take from them their strength, the joy of their glory, which is the temple in Jerusalem, the desire of their eyes, that whereupon they set their minds, their sons and their daughters. Now notice in verse 26, a prophecy. There's going to be one that escapes from Jerusalem, shall come unto thee. Tell you what's happened back in Jerusalem. Remember, there's no news. There's nothing going between these places. Somebody will arrive and tell you what's happened back in Jerusalem. And when that man arrives, your days of dumbness will be over. Verse 27, I'll open your mouth to him that has escaped, and you can speak and be no more dumb. You shall still be a sign to them, and they will know that you are Yahweh. So here is the last greatest mime that he has to do, not to mourn for his wife. So when you see it in its context, it's not such a great thing, is it? The fact that Ezekiel loved this woman so much tells us she was a very spiritual woman. They had 12 hours to mourn inside their house. And she must have accepted the will of God. It says in Hebrews 11, women not accepting deliverance. And God took a faithful woman to help us to see the divine view of things. And we have to see the divine view, brethren and sisters. You know, we are trained by this world to think that we are owed a long and prosperous life. And yet we are mortal. She was less than 30. There's a great lesson in how differently God sees death, isn't it? We hang on grim to this mortal frame, we stuff it full of pills and we put in false joints and do all these things to keep ourselves going. But God rewarded the faithful King Josiah. You're a wonderful guy, Josiah. I love your attitude. You're going to die. I don't want you to see the evil that's going to come on your sons. Did God need to replace Job's first 10 children? Like all the animals were doubly replaced? Of course not. They're in the kingdom. And we have to learn, brethren and sisters, that this life is only a pathway to eternity. It's a vapor that passes away. It's the short introduction to the long play that is coming in the kingdom. You know, God says to us, here is the patience of the saints. Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth. Yea, saith the Spirit, that they may rest from their labours. Do we actually say that at funerals? There are some people who die after long suffering and we say, blessed are the dead because now a suffering is over. But every one of God's dead is blessed because they are surely going to come out of that grave. And Ezekiel had to go through the rest of his life lonely, sad, weeping inside for that woman. But knowing that God had taken her, that some people might be converted. And another 2 lonely years go by. Remember, this is the 10th month of the 9th year. Another 2 lonely years go by. The long siege continues in Jerusalem. Now come to chapter 33 and see the fulfillment of that prophecy about the man that escaped. Chapter 33 and verse 21. Came to pass in the 12th year of our captivity. Now the city fell in the 11th year and the 10th month. So it took months for this man who was probably on the run, hiding from the Babylonians, to finally make his way back to Babylon. In the 5th day of the month, the one that escaped out of Jerusalem came unto me, saying, the city is smitten. So here is the fulfillment of the prophecy. Now the hand of Yahweh was upon me in the evening, before he that was escaped came. So the night before, God had opened his mouth, because the man was in the city. He came in the morning, and my mouth was open, and I was no more dumb. So there is the end of the 6.5 years of dumbness. As soon as this man turns up, God opens his mouth, and he can now speak to the people freely. So you can imagine when Ezekiel's got his voice back, what would happen the next day? They would come in their droves to hear Ezekiel explain about his wife. To actually, now that the city has fallen and Ezekiel's words have come to pass with great accuracy, everybody wants to listen to Ezekiel. They shall know that a prophet has been among them, says God. And they certainly would. Well, let's just read about the crowd that came the next day. Again, it's all the elders. Chapter 33 and verse 30. And I can imagine Ezekiel thinking, it was terrible that my wife died, but they're all going to come and be converted now. Now that this has actually happened, they're going to sit there and everything I say will be like gems of gold to them. and their hearts will be changed. That's how you'd feel, wouldn't you? Well, verse 30, God says, don't get carried away, Ezekiel. Son of man, the children of thy people are still talking against thee or of thee. So they're not listening to what you're saying about themselves. They're talking about you. Well, we know what they said, doesn't it? They're talking about you by the walls and the doors of their house. Now, before I get on to that, I want to just talk about why God had muzzled his prophet. You know, we often wonder about the ways of God, don't we? Why did God make it so hard for the Jews to get to the real message of Ezekiel? Why were there such limited revelations of what could have been said? Why were there signs and charades and mimes and strange events that took place? And he can't explain them. You know, sometimes we sit back and we ask, why is Bible prophecy so complicated? Why are we trying to unravel rams and goats and bears and four-headed leopards and dragons and ten-horned beasts and harlots? Why doesn't God make it easier? Those of you who teach the truth, you think sometimes, why does God put so many passages in the Bible that can be read for Trinitarians and demons and devils and hell and spirit gifts? And we're always trying to explain away wrested scriptures. Why doesn't God just say, look, here's 24 points, take it or leave it? But God's not like that, brethren and sisters. God said to these Jews, you're a rebellious house, I'm going to make it harder for you. My favourite saying, as many of you know, is the Brother Thomas, where he says, the deity delights in stimulating the intellect of his creatures. In doing so, he reveals himself mysteriously. It's why Jesus spoke in parables. It's why God uses signs, symbols, metaphors, complicated forms of revelation. Because he does expect us to grapple with his words, to seek their depths, to seek out the hidden meanings, to have a love of finding truth. And that struggle to unravel these things aids our memory and gives us vision. You know, God reveals himself in Bible code to his servants. But if you don't have a love of finding truth, you will be deluded, says God. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 10 to 12. 3 times, if you don't have a love of the truth, God will delude you. And that's why there are so many difficult passages in the Bible. People who approach it with a preconceived notion will get lost. You've got to have that love of the truth. Look at Ezekiel chapter 3. Just keep your hand there. I want to show you a phrase in Ezekiel 3 that I bet you missed on the way through. You know, this concept of God not making it easy is something we need to get our heads around. You ignore God's counsel, he will not make it easier. Ezekiel 3 verse 20, he's talking about the righteous man. This is the man that has been doing the right thing. When a righteous man turns from his righteousness and commits iniquity, now the natural man would say, God will go after him and make it easy for him to come back. No, God says, I will lay a stumbling block in front of him. So a man who knows better turns his back on God. God says, I will make it harder and harder for him to get it right. But you've still got to warn him. And that's totally contrary to the way the human would see that. That's what God says I will do. Now you think about this in Bible history. God said to Balaam, do not go with these men. Thou shalt not curse this people, for they are a blessed people. And Balaam comes back and says, look, they've come back again. Can I go? And God says, you can go. And Balaam's ears go, beauty, if the men call thee in the morning. Did God make it easier for Balaam? See, God now said, oh, you can go. You only heard that bit. The rest of it, he ignored it. And I bet those men that came from the king of Moab slept soundly in the morning. And Balaam's getting them out of bed and saying, come on, we're off. God said I can go. You see, he was a selective hero. Think of King Saul. After 7 days, I will come, said Samuel. And God waited right until the actual death knock. And Saul says, I can't wait any longer. Think of Judas and how Judas tried to save him. You see, when you decide to do the wrong thing, when you're a righteous man and you decide to do the wrong thing, it will not get easier to find your way back. So easy we become selective hearers. So that's why God put this incredible sign in front of them. That's why God made it hard. But now Ezekiel can open his mouth. Now, just while we're in chapter 3, let's just pick up the other theme of Ezekiel, being the watchman. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because you know what watchmen do. Right at the start of his prophecy, he was told he would be a watchman. In chapter 3 and verse 17, God gave him all kinds of visions, statements to make, but it's repeated over in chapter 33. So let's come back to chapter 33. And now when he's got his voice back, again he's commissioned as a watchman in chapter 33 and verse 7. Son of man, I've set thee to be a watchman to the house of Israel. So God is prefacing the return of his own voice. You've had 6.5 years saying only what I put in your mouth. Now you're going to be able to speak freely, and you're still a watchman. And you have to be just as faithful in what you now say of your own opinion as you said when you were repeating my words. You're a watchman. And we have all the same things about watchmen. You know what watchmen do. We all know what watchmen do. You know, they blow the trumpet, don't they? You've got to warn them, otherwise the blood is upon your head. God has no pleasure in the death of the wicked, says verse 11. I have no pleasure, says God, in people dying. Turn to me. Why will you die? So now Ezekiel can speak. Now just come back to that end of chapter 33. And Ezekiel has now got this second commission to be a watchman. His voice is now opened, and he thinks, isn't it fantastic? Won't they now listen? Well, God says, look. And can I just say that from verse 30 to verse 33 is one of the greatest exhortations you'll find in Ezekiel for us, because we are very prone to the sin of these elders. They're talking against thee, or of thee, as the margin says. They were judging the words of Ezekiel by the quality of delivery and not its personal application. They were keen to hear the word expounded, but very reluctant to do anything about their complacency. They were like the man of James 1 who looks in the mirror and says, oh dear, my hair is all out of place, but I haven't got time to do anything about it. In verse 32, verse 31, they come unto thee as the people cometh, and they sit before thee as my people. They look like disciples. And they hear thy words, but they will not do them. What was their attitude in verse 32? They were brilliant at analysing the speakers and comparing them. To them, Ezekiel was a performer. It's like us going to a symphony concert. We're enthralled by the music. We see the talent on show. But it doesn't change your heart, does it? It does nothing for your heart. It's just another performance. And too much of this happens, brethren and sisters, in our midst. We hear the word unfolded, and then we start to rationalise it away. Oh, well, he's a bit extreme on that, and you'd expect that from East Torrens. And, you know, it just goes on. We start to rationalise it. It doesn't apply to me. God doesn't really expect that we should have to do those hard things. We do exactly what these people did. If your only comment at the end of a Bible talk is, well, he wasn't in good form as he usually is, or like my grandmother used to say, I hope so-and-so was listening, then you've got a problem. You've got the same problem as these people. And verse 33 says, when this comes to pass, the future words of Ezekiel from here, and it will come, says God, then they shall know that a prophet has been among them. So, brethren and sisters, don't get caught up in the very common problem of thinking we have the right to analyse and compare speakers. It's one of the great sins of our community that we put people on pedestals because they can speak better than other people. I want you to come back now to chapter 3, and we're going to conclude in chapter 14. Ezekiel was told at the outset that God's word is sweet to eat and bitter to digest. Verse 1 to 2, he was given a scroll. A hand with a scroll was before him. Eat this scroll. The knowledge was sweet. It was like honey in his mouth, he says at the end of verse 3. But it was bitter to digest. In chapter 2 and verse 10, when the scroll was first delivered, there were lamentations and mourning and woe within it. The impact on him in chapter 3 and verse 14, I went in my bitterness and the heat of my spirit. So there's this great anomaly of beautiful to eat, beautiful to understand, but hard to digest. You know, the same thing happens in Revelation 10 to John the Apostle. He eats the seventh thunder scroll. Sweet to taste, bitter to digest. And we love to know what God says about the future. We love to talk about Armageddon. But a lot of what we have to say to the world is going to be very sad news for some. God is going to utterly wipe out the wicked and everything they stand for in our world. God's going to wipe out the Catholic Church. That is not popular news. The true spirit of prophecy will always generate a sense of sadness and grief, even inside the brotherhood. We lament like Enoch at the decline we see happening around us, the gradual erosion of our brotherhood. We see the supporters of theistic evolution with the intrusive internet getting into people's brains with the wisdom of this world. We're pressured on all fronts to compromise with the humanist world, who only want to hear a positive, easy message. Love Jesus Christ, do good works, avoid controversy, and Jesus accepted everybody. Well, it's not right, brethren and sisters. That's not what God said. The scroll is bitter to the taste. We have to deliver messages that are unpopular. I believe we're going to be faced very soon with ecclesias compromising on marriage in or out of the truth, on morality, the feminist agenda. We have to say that the word of God is clear, it's got lamentations, it's got woe, and it's got very clear principles. We cannot no longer think we're going to save everybody. But like Ezekiel, we can save the remnant. He was never going to convince those elders. God said, look, you're wasting your time with them. These are the people that grew up in the reign of Jehoiakim. You will not change these people. Work on their children. Now come to Jeremiah chapter 15. You know, Jeremiah was a man who also wanted to save the whole nation. Chapter 14 of Jeremiah is all about Jeremiah's prayer for the nation. He prayed to God that the nation might be saved. And God says, Jeremiah, this is remarkable. Jeremiah, stop praying for them. You're wasting your words. You're wasting my time. Don't pray for these people anymore. Now, that's remarkable for God to say to his prophet, don't pray for them. Absolutely a waste of time, Jeremiah. What you've got to do, Jeremiah, is look after the ones I've given you. Jeremiah chapter 15 and verse 11. Yahweh said, verily, it shall be well with thy remnant. Jeremiah, you've got to focus on the remnant. Now, notice that word very particularly, the remnant. Because I'm going to make sure they survive the siege. All the people that I know that are good people left in Jerusalem, they will all survive the siege. Not one of them will be killed in the siege. Ebed-Melech was a classic example. Barak was another one. Gedaliah was another one. So God says, I'm going to preserve that remnant, Jeremiah. Now, he was saying to Jeremiah, look, Jeremiah, you're so busy trying to save everybody, you're wasting the time you could spend on the remnant. Go and talk to them. Look at the Sunday school class he then developed. Daniel, Mordecai, Meshach, Shadrach and Abednego, Gemariah, Habakkuk, Micaiah, Zephaniah, Gedaliah, Ezekiel and his wife, Ezra and Ahiokim. All of those were in Jeremiah's Sunday school class. What a remnant, brethren and sisters. And what did God say he would do with them? Well, he said this. Jeremiah 24, you know so well. God says, and this is a prophecy of the captivity of Jehoiachin. I will acknowledge them that are carried captive of Judah. Look what God says, whom I have sent. So when God took this second captivity, it included people like Ezekiel and his wife that God said, I'm going to pick them up and I have sent them away for their good. And I will set mine eyes upon them for good, says God. That means the angels are going to be everywhere around them because the angels are God's eyes. And they are the ones I will bring back. So they've got to be young people we're talking about here. I will bring them back, says God, and build them. I will give them a heart to know me, says God. A heart to know me. Where did we start off? In Ezekiel 3 verse 10. Let these words go into your heart. I'm going to put a heart in these people because these elders have got nothing but idols in their heart. To know me that I am Yahweh. That's almost Ezekiel, isn't it? They shall know that I am Yahweh. And they shall be my people and I shall be their God. You know, we sang in our opening hymn about put thy law within their hearts. Bring them back again from their captivity. So God says, I'm going to send this particular group away, that the next generation that comes back after the 70 years will be a much better generation. Now, how's God going to do that? Well, Ezekiel is going to take over the Sunday school class and youth group from Jeremiah. From all the dates we have, it seems Ezekiel only prophesied for 27 years. Maybe some of the latter chapters of Ezekiel came in later years, but they're not dated. It would be another 40 years from the last dated message that we have in Ezekiel until the decree of Cyrus. So get that right. 70 years captivity. The first 30 years, he's very active in prophecy. The remaining 40 years of the captivity until the decree of Cyrus, there's almost nothing recorded of Ezekiel and his preaching. So what's he doing for that last 40 years? Well, you think about the quality of those that went back. How improved spiritually they were. Remarkably, after the exile in Babylon, the Jewish nation never, ever, ever served idols again. You think of the change of the mentality of that nation from the days of Jehoiakim and what Josiah inherited from Manasseh. You think of how much that had got it. Never, ever again do you read of idols in Israel. Much of their improvement was due to the influence of Ezekiel and Daniel. The new generation had people in it like Joshua, Zerubbabel, Nehemiah, Ezra, Haggai, and Zechariah, and Joshua the high priest to lead it spiritually. Poor old Jeremiah, he never saw any national revival. He never saw any repentance in his lifetime. But Ezekiel would witness the spiritual regeneration of the people, of these exiles, working with Daniel to prepare the good figs to go back. And when the decree of Cyrus finally came, about 50,000 volunteered to go. And most were outstanding people like Nehemiah's wall building in 52 days. And all the different people who contributed. And this new generation that would go back would take with them Ezekiel's vision of the latter glory of the house. Remember, Haggai said to them, don't worry about this house that you're building. You are building for the latter glory of the house. And they had that vision. They could read from Ezekiel what the latter glory of the house would look like. I'd love to have heard Ezekiel explaining his prophecies about the house of the age to come. So you see the great work of making the good figs fit for return, that they shall know in their hearts that I am Yahweh, was the work of Ezekiel. Now let me prove it to you. Chapter 14 of Ezekiel and verse 23. Now remember, God said to Jeremiah, look after the remnant. Stop praying for this people. I've given you a remnant. That's the ones you've got to work with, Jeremiah. Well, look what he says to Ezekiel. Verse 22, yet behold, therein, that is, in the siege of Jerusalem, shall be left a remnant that shall be brought forth. This is Jeremiah 24 exactly, the good figs. Both sons and daughters, young people. And behold, Ezekiel, they shall come forth unto you. You put that together. God says this. Jeremiah's been doing a great work on the Sunday school and youth group back in Jerusalem, but the time has come for Jerusalem to fall. I'm going to take them out of Jeremiah's grasp, and I'm going to give them to you, Ezekiel. I'm going to send them to you. Very specific, isn't it? And ye shall see their doings, their ways and their doings. You're going to see the quality of these young people that Jeremiah has been working on. And it'll get over the sorrow of the loss of Jerusalem. You shall be comforted concerning the evil I've brought upon Jerusalem, even concerning all that I've brought upon it. You will be able to manage your own grief at the loss of Jerusalem and the temple by the comfort you will get from this remnant I'm going to bring to you. And verse 23 is beautiful. And they shall comfort you. He'd just lost his wife when they all came, when the last batch came after the final fall of Jerusalem. They shall comfort you when you see their ways and their doings. You're going to be inspired by this next generation, Ezekiel, to go on even without your wife. And ye shall know that I have done it. I've not done it without cause. What's he referring to? You will know that your wife didn't die in vain. You will know that Jerusalem is not fallen without some purpose for the future. You will know I've not done it without cause. And to a man that was going to be grieving for his wife, he would read those words again and again and be greatly comforted by those that God had sent to him. As times become more and more critical, brethren and sisters, let us be content to work with those who do want to understand the visions of God, who do want to follow divine principles. Let's educate people to be sensitive to what's going on in their heart. And let us have our minds stimulated by these wonderful things that God has written so uniquely to stimulate our intellect. And let's work with the remnant. You know, Jesus said, strengthen the things that remain.